So tonight we come across the last installation of the objectives of fasting by Imam Sheikh al-Islam Izzuddin Abdul Salam. And this is presented to you by Islamic Learning Foundation, Chicago. We were having some technical difficulties, so we're just going to do this by way of audio. If there's any questions, just post them by way of the YouTube text or even the Facebook live text box, and then we'll get back to you, inshallah. So we now are in the last chapters, 2 chapters, and the chapter 4 is dealing with those matters that need to be avoided during the fast. The fiqh of fasting, or the details of how to fast, that's a separate course which is being presented, and we would hope that people are participating in that to get a detailed understanding. If not, then we can assist you in the process of trying to resolve whatever issues you have, or respond to any questions that you have with regard to the fiqh of fasting. Imam Izzuddin Abdul Salam, he talked about the spiritual dimensions of fasting and what we should be aiming at with regard to what it is that we're trying to get out of the fast. And we talked about the issue of blocking the means to shaitan by way of having our senses in a state of fasting. So basically in a state of abstention. Fasting in the Arabic language means abstaining. And so it's a non-action. So basically what we're talking about is depriving our senses of the input that comes through the eyes, the ears, or that basically comes by way of the tongue outwardly, or that, basically the body engages in as far as sense actions and so on and so forth, of pleasure. And just, for instance, being focused on things which are really not bringing us into that orbit of spiritual development. What I mean by that is basically helping us in our relationship with Allah. There's things that help us in our relationship with Allah, and those things are pretty much clear cut. And there's other things which are harmful to us, and those things are pretty much clear cut. And there's things which can be neutral, they can help us, and maybe if they're abused, they can go the wrong way. Like overeating, food helping us in the whole process of coming to Allah. Imam Izzuddin Abdul Salam, he follows the Sunnah in this regard, and he follows the teachings of the ulama. That food, how is it that it helps us in the time of Ramadan to come close to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, is that we take the suhoor. We take the suhoor as close as possible to the time of fasting, so that it aids the body by giving it physical strength, so that we're able to carry on that activity of fasting, and also that we're able to carry on other activities of worship, whether it be the recitation of the Quran, which we know that to be focused, you need glucose content, in the bloodstream, so to speak. And so food, is not prohibited totally in Islam, but is restricted. And so, for instance, in that case, to take a proper meal, nothing that it goes beyond the means, meaning that it's not an issue of overloading on food, but it's the issue of doing with that which is necessary and doing without excess. And so, for instance, if we were to overeat, and we were to overeat for the suhoor and overeat for breaking the fast, then that becomes an issue where a neutral action, or action that can be, it can help us to come close to Allah. It becomes an action which takes us away from the whole intent of fasting, and in that sense takes us away from Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. And so, that's what, he is looking at, like, what are the objectives of fasting, and how is it that we can undertake a program? How is it that we can organize ourselves, our time, our action, so that we're able to use this time of Ramadan, which is a blessed time, as the month of the Quran, is the month in which the Quran was revealed. And it's a time of forgiveness. How can we use this time, this opportune time, to come close to Allah, in which we find ourselves in a state in which shaitan doesn't have a lot of influence over us because of what was said prior to that, because we're depriving our senses. The senses are the means by which shaitan has influence over us. And that's something that is necessary as a lesson to take, after Ramadan, and we carry that lesson with us and we hold it as a shield to protect ourselves. So for instance, overeating, it encourages desire, and desire puts us in a situation in which we find ourselves weakened in our willpower, and then we are susceptible to satanic attacks. So for instance, we find ourselves without defense. Fasting, what it does to us is it breaks the desire on multiple levels. The desire of eating, and forgive me for saying, but even the sexual desire puts it in control. And so those two things, Imam al-Ghazali rahmatullahi say, the desire of the stomach and the desire of the physical organs, in that sense, the private parts, so to speak, they become vehicles either to support us in worship, or they become vehicles that take us away from Allah Ta'ala and put us at risk. That's a serious issue that needs to be discussed amongst families, and it needs to be discussed in the community, because there's too much of an unrestricted access to food, lack of discipline, and then also in today's time with the way that technology is, there's a lot of things which people are looking at, and it's not to be the goody two shoe, the holy type of roller type of person, but we have to be very honest that we live in a time where there's a lot of contamination when it comes to looking at things that we shouldn't look at. And it doesn't have to be anything very out there and extreme, but there's some things that just don't benefit us. So the fasting, what it does is it cuts the rope to all of those things which load us down and take us out. And so, he wants to make sure that we are very confident in our understanding that the fasting breaks the ties to shaitan. And so when we say that the shayateen are tied up, that's primarily what we're talking about. We're not talking about some, imaginary conceptualization that some people have, in which they imagine shaitan, chained somewhere, and that's in their imagination how this works. And then all of a sudden they find themselves in confusion, because when they see the world moving on and they see evil activities in the world, they're like, well, we thought that shaitan was chained up, and so, how is it the case that people are still performing sins and deeds that go against the commands of Allah Ta'ala if shaitan and the shayateen are chained up? And so that really is not a mature understanding of what the teachings of Islam mean by the fact that the shayateen are tied down. And we mentioned what that means in the understanding of the ulama of Islam, or the scholars of Islam, is that the means by which shaitan takes to you to influence you become restricted, because you yourself are restricting in this time of barakah, in this time of great blessing, with the help of Allah Ta'ala, the pathway to shaitan. And the pathway to shaitan is to take control over our senses, our seeing, our tasting and eating, our hearing, our movement with the body. We're engaging as full beings in the time of Ramadan in acts of worship with a purpose behind them that's very clear as a community, and that's to elevate our station spiritually. And the means by which we do this is by abstention, by abstaining, by doing without. And so this is a passive activity in sense, and is a great act of mujahadat al-nafs, or a great act of striving against the self to bring the self to health. There are people, some of our youth, they lack, and not only the youth, even adults, they lack control over anger, not realizing that sometimes anger is coming from uncontrolled. Not all anger is bad. Justice, demands some sort of anger as long as it's not destructive. But there's some types of anger which go beyond the limits and cause us to engage in domestic violence, cause us to engage in violence towards others, cause us to say things that are problematic, like utter a word of divorce, or cause us to say things which we shouldn't say. And so, for instance, we don't realize that sometimes that anger comes from not having a control over ourselves. And some people may have a high blood pressure, and the high blood pressure pushes them to that. And that comes from also not having a state of equilibrium in the body to some extent. But it's not totally the case that we can just attribute everything to health reasons. When we lose control, what I'm saying, we're reminded of gaining control, and that could be control over our minds, control over our emotions, or control over our actions or our thinking or whatever it may be. And Ramadan becomes that time. So the things now that we look at are those things which are prohibited or should be avoided. And one of those things is continuous fasting. And we mentioned this before, but we mentioned it again. The continuous fasting, it can mean to fast, from to fast the whole 24 hours, to fast the whole 24 hours continuously. That's one way of looking at it or understanding it. And continuous fasting could be that we're fasting on a regular basis without stopping, without end, even if it is the legislative fast of Ramadan. That's something that is not encouraged for the most part. The Prophet ﷺ ate and drank, and he fasted and he also married. And so those are acts which are from the Sunnah, the acts of balance. That sometimes you fast, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you abstain from physical intimacy within the context of marriage, sometimes you don't. Sometimes, you, as some of the ulama may even say, there may be some times where you eat a little bit, beyond what you would eat normally. And we know that, the fistful is what is recommended for us to ingest as far as a healthy diet is concerned. Sometimes you may go beyond that. It may be delightful food or, something that is tasty, so to speak. But in other words, in general, there should be balance. And so the reason why this type of fasting is prohibited in the deen is because it weakens the physical strength of the person, and it turns to weaken the ibadah. The reason why ibadah, meaning worship of the person, physical strength deteriorates. And we see that. We know that, for instance, children that go to school without eating breakfast, or without even having something to eat throughout the day, we know that they can't focus on their own development. And we see is already known that even that can alter their own physical growth. And so, for instance, the issue of doing without, it can cause harm. It can cause harm if it's not done in a balanced way. Matter of fact, some of the ulama, even I remember one of the scholars from the UK, when I was in Egypt, he visited me and we had the conversation about students of knowledge, what was more appropriate for them to fast, because a lot of them were not married, or to eat, you know what I'm saying, and to strengthen themselves in a balanced way. And he said to strengthen the self is, in that case, something that's recommended because they have a task that's before them, which is to study. And that knowledge path is something that's necessary in the ummah. So in the case of fasting, we see that the suhoor, taking to the meal before the pre-dawn meal or prior to fajr, that meal is from the sunnah, and we see that the purpose of that is to strengthen us. Just like, for instance, to abstain from fasting on other occasions may be for the purpose of strengthening the body so that we can undertake a task. So the issue of Sawm al-Wisal, or the fast with continuity is something that is not encouraged in Islam. That's something to consider. The second thing is the issue of kissing. There's a type of kiss which is affectionate and is not full of desire. And there's another type of kiss which is, appropriate within the context of marriage. And so, for instance, the idea here is that the kissing in and of itself is not a problem if it doesn't lead to, the striking up of desire and lead a person to be in an uncontrolled state. And so, for instance, the kissing, it will be determined as being a problem if the person doesn't know how to control themselves. But the kiss of affection, like here on the cheek, like the way that some people in some cultures, some families, they express love in that way. There's no problem with that because that's not considered to be a kiss of desire. But the kissing on the mouth is considered to be a kiss of desire, and that really comes back to whether that person can control himself or not. Right? Whoever is of age or is able to control his or her desires, right? Then without invalidating his or her fast, then the act of kissing is not a problem. If he is young and is doubtful, then it is disliked because of the dangers of invalidating the fast, which in the case You find that in the Maliki school, especially, the issue of striking up the desire in the fast is something that is extremely, extremely discouraged. It's problematic, and it goes beyond that. There's some fiqh issues to that, but I'm not going to go into that. The other issue, which is this, maybe disliked for some people, is the issue of hijama. Hijama is not disliked if it doesn't weaken the person, but if the person becomes weak, then is disliked. The hijama is a practice that the Muslims engage in, and others, but the Muslims specifically, is the whole issue of cupping, bloodletting, and is done for health reasons. You know what I'm saying? It's done for health reasons. If people were to do that, especially, they would have to practice physical distancing. I'm changing the whole concept of social distancing because we don't want to be separate from each other socially. We want to have distance physically, but not socially, because we have commitments to each other. And so, for instance, if someone were to undertake hijama under those circumstances, or under circumstances that we're living in, I would hope that they make sure, that they're taking the means to protect themselves from the coronavirus. Exaggerating in wudu and taking water in the nostrils during the time of wudu, or even when you wash the mouth, you may gargle, whatever. That's something that's disliked, because now you're putting yourself, if you're taking the water up too much into the nostril, the water is going to come through your throat and it's going to come into your belly, and it's going to invalidate your fast. And so, for instance, the wudu should be done properly, and meticulously. But the issue of thoroughly rinsing the nose, you have to be cautious in that one, and also the issue of the mouth. But it's allowable to rinse the mouth and to rinse the nose, and that's something that he talked about. But the issue of exaggerating in that, or going to a point of meticulousness, so that the point of it possibly going into the nose is problematic. Is that these are the things that he's mentioning, and these are the things that we want to focus on. The last thing that he focuses on is on the issue of Laylatul Qadr. Laylatul Qadr. Right? And he talks about Laylatul Qadr as being, the virtue of it is that is a night that's better than 1,000 nights. And so the acts of ibadah are multiplied, right? It should, the night of Laylatul Qadr, by some of the ulama, it's very popular to say that it comes in the last 10 nights of Ramadan. Sheikh Qaradawi, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, and although we know that some of his fatwa, some people disagree with, and that's not our issue here. We want to just focus on this point of scholarship that he brings up with regard to Ramadan and with regard to Laylatul Qadr, and what he has come to in researching what the ulama have said in the text of the Quran and Sunnah in this regard. One of the things that he had encouraged, which I think is very proper to encourage, because we have changed the meaning of Laylatul Qadr and we have changed the meaning of the last 10 nights, because we like to identify one night as being that night of Laylatul Qadr with certainty. That's not the case. Laylatul Qadr, he said that there's so many different aqwal or statements of the ulama that technically it can even come in the beginning of Ramadan. There's some even that said that it comes outside of Ramadan, but it had a qawlun shadh. That's not something really that is a statement that is really relied upon by the scholars. But he had encouraged for people to look for Laylatul Qadr from the beginning of Ramadan on the odd nights, and to stop this practice of isolating Laylatul Qadr to be one day in the last 10 days or the last 10 nights of Ramadan, like you're certain that that's the night. The reason why is because there's cultural practices which have been meshed in with religion, where some people will come to the masjid only during that time, in the time of Ramadan, and they will come to make ibadah only in that, and then the masjid is empty, or the acts of ibadah on other nights are not equivalent to what is done during that night. And that is a mistake, because he mentioned that Laylatul Qadr is hidden from us, the exact time. We have some indications, and of those indications is the last 10 nights, the odd nights. Outside of that, there's no certainty that it is within a specific night. Although there's customary practices, but there is no certainty. There's no clear text which is saying this is Laylatul Qadr during this night. But we have text meaning we have proof from the Quran and the Sunnah, specifically the Ahadith, that are pointing out to the last 10 nights and the odd nights. But that's the teaching that has come to us as a general community. But some of the ulama had discussed Laylatul Qadr even possibly coming in the beginning or even in the middle of Ramadan, but what has become popular amongst the scholars because they lean on it, because it seems to have more strength, is the last 10 nights. But the teaching of the Shaykh in this regard has a lot of weight, because he's saying that, we should take advantage of Ramadan from the beginning to the end. And so, for instance, that has created a culture of abandonment of periods of Ramadan, in which we could be gaining the reward by our efforts in ibadah, depending upon Allah, imanan wa ihtisaban. We're fasting Ramadan and we're engaging in acts of worship in Ramadan, having iman and waiting from Allah wa ta'ala the reward, having iman that it is a time that is blessed, it's a time of barakah, and is a time in which our harakah, our movement, is blessed and multiplication. And that the fast of Ramadan itself is a fast in which the reward that comes to us is unlimited, is one of those acts of worship, and we mentioned this before, in which Allah wa ta'ala has taken charge of declaring what is the reward for. And we mentioned before that the reward for a fast that sound that approximates or actually realizes, we approximate Allah by it, but we gain forgiveness. That if it's a fast that is done properly, that the reward of it is Jannah. It's not just forgiveness of our sins in a basic way, but the reward of it is Jannah, or the hereafter. And there's a gate called the Rayyan, by which the fasting people enter through, and that gate beckons, it calls unto the people of fasting. Not just the fast of Ramadan, fast in general, but the fast of Ramadan is something that is identified. And so then that Laylatul Qadr, the search for it, we should get into the practice of breaking out of our cultural understandings, which limit us religiously. Laylatul Qadr, we know clearly that there's some texts which indicate the last 10 nights, and like the night of power is within the last 10 nights of Ramadan. It should be sought in the last 10 nights while looking for it within the odd nights. That's what Shaykh Izzuddin Abdul Salam says, and many of the other ulama, if you notice, he didn't identify a particular night except the odd nights. And that's because the text indicate to that. But again, this has caused an imbalance in our practice of Ramadan, and there's other statements of the scholars which indicate other things which are virtuous. And that is to begin to look for Ramadan from the beginning. If you follow this opinion, that is the last 10 nights, then you should use the beginning of Ramadan as a preparation to be able to take benefit from the last 10 nights. This fast and this time of Ramadan will be odd for many of us. And in specific, because the masjid will be something that is absent or not central in our practice of Ramadan. And so, for instance, we're going to have to create an environment for ourselves in which the beginning of Ramadan, the middle of Ramadan, and the end of Ramadan is something that we're taking full benefit from, right? We're taking full benefit from. And part of that is this whole attitude of taking benefit from the beginning, searching for the reward from the beginning, and culminating with, elevating ourselves towards the end. There were some of the ulama, like Sheikh Usama Abdul Adim and Sheikh Muhammad al-Dabisi. These are ulama from Egypt, from the ulama of Azhar. They are known in Egypt, in Cairo. They are known for being people of ibadah, meaning that they are known for engaging in acts of ibadah outside of Ramadan. They're known for engaging in long salawats, long prayers. They're known for being people of the Quran. And so, for instance, one of the things is that in Ramadan they doubled and tripled on their ibadah, and that's something that was known as something that's known amongst people that have studied in Egypt, that they tripled. The ulama of Deoband were also known to that. There's a book that's published, the Ramadan of our elders, by Maulana Ibrahim Maimun, who was in Buffalo for some time, and he's in Canada now. And his father was commissioned to establish a madrasa in New York. And he had, if I remember properly, they had left the UK or it was Medina, one of the two, to establish a madrasa in New York. He compiled a book in which the ulama of Deoband was showing a program of ibadah, of what they would do, a program of worship, of what they would do in the time of Ramadan. And they would drop everything, and they would restrict what they did during that time of Ramadan to be able to focus. The ulama of Egypt and Azhar, more specifically, outside the ones that I mentioned, would abandon most things except teaching the Quran, and so that became a practice among some people. Some ulama, had that type of practice. And so you find that amongst the Muslims themselves, some people engage in certain things, certain types of routines, more specifically, is what I'm referring to, that assist them in the process of taking benefit from the time of Ramadan. And so, for instance, a part of taking benefit from the time of Ramadan is understanding that the time of Ramadan, from the beginning to the middle to the end, all of it is a time which is propitious, is beneficial, is open to benefit, right? And that's important. Of the virtues is that whoever observes the night of power, Laylatul Qadr, with iman and hope from Allah wa ta'ala that Allah will forgive our sins and reward us, that we will gain forgiveness for our previous sins. And one of the dua that is made is a simple dua, Allahumma innaka al-afu tuhibbu al-afwa fa'afu anni. That Allah wa ta'ala, right, we're saying, oh Allah, you are the one who forgives greatly, and you love to forgive, so forgive me, fa'afu anni. And we mentioned that before, that for instance in dua qunut, that one of the things that distinguishes this dua from others is that it's very personalized. It's very personalized. It's a personalized dua. It's a personalized dua. One thing that I want to mention, and it may be a little controversial, but in the Maliki madhab, there's a fatwa that is not practiced. But there's a fatwa that is not practiced, but that fatwa says that itikaf can be performed anywhere for reward. The general practice of the Muslim community has been that the itikaf is practiced in a masjid in which there's Jum'ah for the most part, and there's some exceptions to that rule. But given the situation that we're in with the coronavirus, these types of fatwa, although they're not popular, can be taken in times of need and hardship, and they can be utilized, right? And so we ask people to make intention to be in itikaf in their homes, based on this fatwa in the Maliki madhab, that this fatwa looked at the situation that the itikaf can be performed anywhere. And so what we ask for people, if they were to take that fatwa as a dispensation, as a way to gain reward for the itikaf, Allah understanding the situation that we're in, that they designate a place in which, for instance, is a place in which within their homes or whatever space that they're in, that it's not a place that you engage in just any action or activity. And so, for instance, if you're going to take to that fatwa, that you take the opportunity to what? You take the opportunity to make that a place in which you're clear-minded, is a place of worship, is a place which is designated, for the remembrance of Allah wa ta'ala. And that's something as a way to aid you, that so when you go into that space, you already, the zone and the vibe and everything that is, related to that space is orienting you to benefiting from your time in Ramadan. And so, we end on that note. And if there's any questions or whatever,